I got a good one for you today. I am excited. I'm going to do a podcast review. I don't do a lot of these. And the last time I did one was about Alex Hormozy podcast that I really liked. And this one I just listened to over the weekend, and I'll show you what it looks like. It is IBBA. If you watch my channel, you know I'm a big fan of the IBBA. This one was called The Broker's Advantage. Stories from both sides of a successful transaction. IBBA Insights, you can find the podcast anywhere. Why am I going to record a review of a podcast when you could just listen to it? Number one, I'm a big fan of the IBBA. I learn a lot from watching podcasts. Maybe if I share why I think it's a good idea for you to listen to the podcast, you'll listen to it, or you can skip the whole thing and get the crux of it. The podcast host is Chris Diglio, and he is an intermediary himself, and he interviewed a buyer and a seller of a business, which is pretty cool. Their deal is done. One had an oil change, a mobile fleet oil change business, and the other one was the buyer, and he owns a tow truck company, and he added this oil fleet business to his as an acquisition. So it was an add-on acquisition. And it was an actual deal. I think it's fascinating to hear after the fact, they got through the whole thing, and then to hear them interviewed of what were your expectations? How did this go? How did that go? So you meet the owner, you meet the buyer, and you listen to both of their experiences, what led them to get to that point, what they both wanted to happen, and what ultimately happened. Here are a few interesting things that I found from listening to this podcast. Number one, the owner who sold his business, so the seller, one of the brokers told him, not the one he hired, but that the business was unsellable. He didn't give up hope, but he interviewed multiple brokers, and he kept interviewing brokers. He said, I was Googling and I was using YouTube to figure out what the right value and stuff was and how the process worked. But ultimately, he said he hired the broker who was the most responsive. So I think that's interesting if you're an owner and you're screening brokers. Responsiveness is certainly something that you can judge them on, because if you hire them and buyers are calling, you want them to be responsive to buyers as well, right? So responsiveness was an attribute that this business owner felt was important in his selection process. The experience level as well was important to him. So he specifically mentioned that, and the interviewer talked about credentials. Having a CBI is the IBBA's credential, but what's the difference between brokers? There's responsiveness, there's knowledge, there's a number of deals done, and the buyer mentioned, does the broker have industry knowledge? These are all different filtering processes that business owners can use if they're screening a buyer, essentially. So I thought it was interesting that the owner said, somebody told me my business was unsellable, but the broker that I hired did not. There were some other interesting points that they both alluded to. They both said that the broker used technology and had a process to get them through diligence. Now, this is another thing. If a buyer and an owner do a deal without a broker, there's not going to be a process. There's probably not going to be a lot of sharing of information in a secure way. So a lot of brokers, including me, I'm an intermediary, use technology to share data confidentially and safely, because you don't want to put tax returns and stuff like that into email. And it happens a lot, but it's not a secure hygiene way in the data breach society that we live in. So technology is something that strong brokers can bring to a deal, along with a process. In fact, the seller said, it was prompted by the interviewer, Chris Diglio, that the broker had prepped him for the whole process. And the interviewer picked up on the fact that buyer used terms like IBBA and SDE and multiples. And he said, you're a savvy buyer. You've done this before. And it was true. You could tell by listening to the buyer and by his stories. I bought multiple companies. I look at businesses all the time. That he was a savvy buyer. Another point the interviewer made is to the seller was self-admitted. This is the first business I've sold. Interviewer says to the seller, hey, look, having a broker allowed you to kind of match wits with this business buyer who's already done this before. They're friends. You can tell by the podcast, the buyer and the owner are on good terms, but he wasn't allowed to beat you up essentially because you had representation from somebody who had the experience that the buyer brought. I thought that was a pretty cool point that the interviewer kind of teased out, and looking at the fact that one was very experienced, one was his first deal, and even the seller said, if I'd done 4 or 5 deals, I may not have needed a broker, but it's my first deal. And by the way, most owners, it is their first deal. Another thing super interesting to me is that the business owner said this thing took forever. It was like 6 months that we were under contract. And very quickly, the buyer remembered differently. He said, actually, I looked at the calendar. It was only 3 months that we were under contract. It may have taken longer for the seller to get to the buyer contract piece. But that's something I see with owners all the time, that it feels like it's taking forever. But often it's going a lot faster than you think. I thought it was interesting, perhaps selfishly, but the seller mentioned, yeah, nobody likes to write a big check, but if I didn't hire a broker, this may not have happened in the time I wanted, at the multiple I wanted. It may have fallen apart in due diligence. There was this notion of cost justifying the investment of hiring a broker. I'm biased. That's why I'm pointing to a podcast that kind of goes through some of these attributes. But all of these are great takeaways about what great intermediaries can do. Wrapping things up a little bit, I want to point out that if you are thinking about hiring a broker, maybe you're a business buyer and you want to work with brokers, the takeaways would be look for a broker that has experience, look for a broker that has a process, technologies, look for a broker that is credentialed. Chris mentioned the CBI, or I have the master CBI from the IBBA. That's the gold standard of broker credentials. And learn from others' experiences. Listen to podcasts like this and do your homework when you hire a broker. To the seller's point, it took 6 months to get this deal done, and that's actually pretty fast. 6 months from hiring to closing the deal. The average deal is 7 to 9 months. So that owner actually got it done quickly. But imagine getting in the boat and rowing out into the ocean. You want to be very comfortable with who you're paddling with. This is an analogy that we use when we talk with owners. We're interviewing them as much as they're interviewing us, and you want to make sure that you have good chemistry, good communication, back to the owner's point, before you make that commitment and hire that broker. That's what I took from this podcast. Let me know what you think. Put your comments below. Thanks for watching. Until next time, Mahala.